Hi, and welcome to Chapter 11 for macroeconomics, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. We'll be looking at macroeconomics, demand and supply, very similar to what we've been talking, demand and supply all along, but explain some things as you'll see in the quizzes for homework and other exercises and readings. We want to understand productivity growth and how changes in input, how that and changes in input prices can impact the supply curve, aggregate supply. Aggregate again just means summary or summing the aggregate of all of the supply in a nation, all of the demand in a nation, and we'll see how that incorporates growth, unemployment, and inflation, some topics we've recently discussed. And we'll talk briefly about neoclassical and Keynesian views. Keep in mind that the next two chapters are on neoclassical and Keynesian views. So 12 and 13 will pick up on those two concepts and go more in depth. So neoclassical, just to give you a bit of a sense, is very supply driven, which made me think of air supply. That's the little disc up in the right corner. Um, and it's very long-term focused. It tends to explain the economy when we look longer term. That's at least 10 years plus out. Say's law says that supply creates its own demand. When we produce a good, then there's income produced for those makers, and then they use that income to buy other goods and services, including what they made and the products that others make. And then that cycle keeps feeding on itself. And a couple of famous classical economists in this neoclassical classical view are Adam Smith, who's known for the invisible hand thinking, free markets, and the limited role of government, and a little more recent David Ricardo, who's thinking about division of labor, comparative advantage, and diminishing returns, things we will talk about in future lectures. So Keynesian economics, in contrast, is demand focused or demand driven instead of supply, and short run focused, 5 years or less. And you probably notice a gap between the 5 and 10 years where some hybrid of the two kinds of views of economics seem to do better at explaining what we actually see happening. It's important to keep in mind that Keynes wrote during the Great Depression, and that had clearly influence over his thinking. But demand creates its own supply, and as a result, when we have recessions where people are losing work, and there is a decrease then in demand for products that they would have otherwise produced, and that's how recession kind of comes into being. There isn't the demand necessary, the demand for labor in this case. And then as those laborers lose jobs, then they don't demand goods and services because they're not earning what they used to. And we're experiencing some of that now in the pandemic. If a recession occurs, though, what Keynes says, now it's the government's job to try and increase demand. And that can increase the need for workers and kind of get the economy back going again. And so their job is to really spend more during a recession and to then reduce their spending during strong periods for consumers and businesses. So classical theory again, they view supply and demand for labor as flexible, meaning that the amount of labor, of jobs that we need or want, the wage that we're willing to pay for workers should be able to go up and down just as easily. And over a long period of time, again, that seems to hold true. Keynesian's view is that the supply and demand for labor in particular is more rigid, that when the demand for goods and services slow down, employers can't just simply lower wages. So, in order to be able to get their costs in alignment, rather than drop everybody's wage, what they tend to do is lay off some of the workforce, increase the number of those who are unemployed. And again, that does very well predict what we see in the short term, at least over a 5 year period when we have these kind of events happen in an economy. So you are seeing here potential GDP. You see that as a straight line. That's kind of if everything was, if we were at full supply demand, we would be on that line. The only thing I want to point out, again, always can pause and read the bottoms, is that AS, it's really just a supply curve. They put the word aggregate in front of it. So you'll start seeing these letters that feel more confusing. This is a supply and demand curve, just as you've seen in any other of my lectures or any other economics class you've taken. But now we're talking aggregate to make sure that we're understand. We're not just talking about nurses. We're not just talking about the U.S. We're talking about, or we're not talking just about a industry or a particular good where we might have looked at bus tickets or something. We're looking at all goods and services, all labor, depending on what's on the axes. And so the full economy is what that aggregate means. Same thing with the demand curve. So it's just a demand curve going down, but the A in front of it means aggregate demand. And then they will cross at a certain point that creates an equilibrium. And that equilibrium, if it's not on this potential GDP line, means that we're not using all of our assets, all of our people, all of our capital, all of our equipment to the fullest possible ability, and as a result, there is opportunity for the economy to be stronger than it is. And if it gets too far to the left of that line, we would start to then label it as a recession. So what kinds of things shift the aggregate supply curve? Well, we talked a little bit about what moves the supply curve. Again, if it goes up, it moves to the right. If it goes down, it moves to the left. Up is to the right, down is to the left for both the supply and the demand curve. And so things more broadly, the blue you'll see changes in input and costs, supply shocks, changes in productivity. Those are the three broad categories that can move supply. But technology, if technology gets us, makes it better, then it will shift it up. Human capital, more skill or more of us. Physical capital, more space or better use of that space. Changes in input costs. So if labor costs go down, we actually will supply more because it costs us less to employ everyone. That's, you got to understand that which things shift it right. In this case, it's a labor cost decreasing, energy costs going down. So when input costs decrease, it makes it easier for us to supply goods and services if we're the maker. And then also supply can be affected by unexpected shocks like worldwide drought, forest fires that are going on, a pandemic that hits, an oil embargo. It can be acts of nature, it can be, or acts of God, it can be war-torn situations, and the things that shock the system. So when there's a change in productivity, that will lead to a change in the potential GDP, or what's known as the long run aggregate supply, kind of the most we could produce as an economy. And that will move that line that was straight up and down on the earlier graphs could move to the right if we have an increase in our productivity potential. And so if we get new technology, new R&D, we become more skilled, we have a bigger workforce. It's a one-way relationship though. Long term always shifts short term supply curves in the same direction. But a short-term supply curve shifting won't necessarily have long-term impact, won't necessarily move the aggregate supply or that straight line up and down. So always the long run will impact the short, but things that happen in the short run don't necessarily have a long or lasting impact. Same with supply, we can look at things that shift the demand curve. And again, up is to the right, down is to the left on all curves. And so things like more income, less taxes. So more income, less taxes, we spend more, whether we're a business or whether we're an individual or household. More wealth will consume more, lower interest rates will consume more. So it's better for us if we make more, if we are worth more, if we have more confidence. It's also better for us if interest rates are lower or taxes are lower. So that's what would shift it to the right. And then the converse, if we make less, we're worth less, or we have less confidence, it would shift it left or down. If there's more taxes or higher interest rates, it would shift it left or down. And then in investing, because consumption is us as consumers, investing on the part of businesses, what do they expect to make? If they expect higher returns, they'll demand more. If the interest rates are high, it's hard for them to borrow. They actually want lower interest rates. Same with us. And they want more business confidence. Government spends, and there's exchange between countries. We talked about this in earlier chapters, but is it easier for foreigners to invest here? Is it easier for us to buy goods and services? Because the price of goods from abroad changes based on whether our dollar is strong or weak compared to if we're buying German goods, the German Deutschmark or the euro, to Japan, the yen, to China, the RMB. So net exports can change as a result of those costs, relative costs of goods and services because we're dealing in different currencies. So you've got short run aggregate supply, SRAS, long run aggregate supply, which is always this kind of optimal where we'd like to be line. And then you have aggregate demand at time 0 and aggregate time at demand at time 1. So a little bit later, you see the shift in equilibrium. And this is a great time for you to and then read the notes and kind of follow through what the graph is teaching you. So there's an exercise that you're going to do today. It's really an opinion, but I'd like you to try and use some good logic to explain why you've taken this opinion. But do you think the government should focus on the long run or the short one? And why do you feel that way? Should they focus on what is good for the economy in the next 5 years, or should they only focus on what's good for the economy 10 plus years from now? And then if whichever you pick, how do you think policies would change if the government focused only on the long run? Because I can tell you a lot of policies are focused more on the short run. So how might policies change if they were focused only on the long run? All right, well, I hope that you are able to give me some interesting thoughts on this, and I'll look forward to talking with you next time. Take care.